The scientific revolution starts now.
This is the Science Joy Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I am Creon Levit, and I am substantially older than either of you. I have been on this earth not quite twice as long as you, but approaching it. Of course, that's weird because as the years march by, our ratio of ages will converge towards one, and we'll be the same age at some point within the error bars. But for now, I was born in the 1960s and in Chicago, Illinois, to intellectual kind of semi-bohemian parents who were first and second generation, respectively, mother and father, and they were both Jewish, escapees from the pogroms and holocausts that were going on in their parents' generations. And my father was an MD, and my mother was a psychologist, and I grew up in Chicago, and I grew up in the south side of Chicago, which, as I was a young child, went from being kind of a working class neighborhood to an all African American, fairly dangerous neighborhood. And during that time, my parents moved me to a very interesting school, which is deserves to be much more widely known, which is called the University of Chicago Laboratory School. And what it is the University of Chicago, Ivy League institution, as part of its graduate education department for training teachers, runs a K through 12 school with about, I don't know, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people in it, students, and they have their teachers learn to teach by teaching in this school that they run, this private school, which is kind of hard to get into, but I got into it. And so I was pulled out of the public schools, which were getting increasingly dangerous, and into this other school that I don't need to go into the details, but it was very advanced. It was like they really nurtured you, and they gave you independent studies if you wanted, and they had all kinds of crazy programs. And you were in the middle of the university, so like we had our science classes in the old university science labs because the new science labs had been built and all the real scientists had moved out of those labs, and we had our orchestra and band practice in the university music building, and we'd be queued up outside waiting for the university orchestras to finish their rehearsals, and they'd come out, and then us little fourth graders would march in and play our instruments and stuff. And so we were in the middle of the university life. It was really quite astonishing on hundreds of levels. We could spend a long time talking about that, but I was very much encouraged to work into my passionate talents that seemed to be developing in math and science and other things too. It wasn't super narrow. And then eventually life got so violent in my neighborhood in the like around 70, 71 that my parents and I moved to the suburbs, the North Shore. And I went back to public school, which was kind of a run-of-the-mill but fairly famous high school. But then when I was in high school, I very quickly, as soon as I could, which was my sophomore year, got put into this alternative program within the big public high school with a few thousand people. And that alternative program allowed us to make our own classes. It was a very kind of 1970s hippie sort of thing. We could make our own classes. We could take classes in the regular school if we wanted to. And so it was called the Center for Self-Directed Learning. And unfortunately, it is no more as far as I know, and at New Trier High School. And then after like 3 years of kind of doing my own thing and being some sort of combination of hippie and computer programmer and math geek and teenage delinquent, I applied to college, and I went to Washington University in St. Louis, pretty nice school. And I majored in computer science, got a degree in computer science, and I was going to stay there for a master's degree. And then I just did some practice job interviews because they had headhunters from different organizations coming around and interviewing people graduating from the engineering school to see if they wanted to make job offers for them. And I had a couple of interesting interviews, but then these people from NASA came in did the job interview, and I was like, wow, I've always wanted to work for NASA, but this was at an era when NASA was kind of contracting after the Apollo program, and the shuttle program hadn't really gone full blast yet. And so I went to this job interview with these NASA headhunters who had come, or HR people who had come to the university and into the recruitment sort of apparatus. And it just so happened that one of the projects they were recruiting for at NASA was a project that I had done a paper about in one of my graduate classes that exact semester. I had like just finished it. And so I knew way more about this particular NASA project that they were interviewing for than the people interviewing me, because they were not the investigators on the project. That was just one of the projects that had open headcount that they were interviewing for. So I knew so much about this project, they kind of immediately flew me to the Bay Area in California to NASA Ames Research Center, where I actually met these people whose papers I'd been reading and, had read all their stuff, and they were just names on papers to me. But I met them and I hung out with them, and they, long story short, they hired me, and so I dropped out of grad school and I went to NASA, and I started working there first as a software engineer on what were at the time the highest end scientific computing devices of the day, like Cray computers and stuff like that. And nowadays laptops are far more powerful, but back then it was a huge deal. And I did sort of computer work there, and then I got more and more interested in the actual problems that the NASA scientists were using these computers to solve. And so I started to get back into physics, which I'd been into previously, and I started learning some of the computational physics that these people were working on. And so I pivoted over into computational physics and started writing specialized simulations in collaboration with them for difficult problems in aerodynamics and molecular quantum mechanics and celestial mechanics and the orbits of the complicated orbits of many body systems. And then I went through a bunch of different things at NASA Ames. I went from that computer stuff and data visualization, virtual reality back during the first VR bubble, and then in the whatever that was, the 90s, and then got into heavily into nanotechnology and quantum molecular science, and then into more classic space mission design and optics. And then I made a whole new set of friends at the higher echelons of NASA, as well as some of the young people that Dr. General Pete Worden, who was the director for my last 7 years at NASA. It's a whole force of nature to be discussed in and of itself. But he brought in a bunch of new young people who were very smart, and they were younger than me, but I decided I was going to force them to become my friends, which I did. And they're now like my surrogate family, and have been for, 15 years or so. And we do all sorts of things together and have properties together and have all sorts of projects together. And some of them at NASA, when we were all together, got really into small satellites or microsatellites or CubeSats or whatever you want to call them. And they actually left NASA and formed a company to do satellite imaging using nanosatellites, and sort of a disruptive approach to satellite imaging, building hundreds of satellites that were super cheap instead of single satellites that were super expensive. And so this company is now called Planet Labs, and I joined them a few years after they started it. And so that's where I'm currently employed for the last 8 years, 8+ years at Planet Labs, which is a satellite imaging data company. We build, launch, and operate what is at present the world's largest constellation of Earth imaging satellites. But we don't sell satellites, and we don't build satellites for other people. We sell the data that comes from our satellites to all sorts of different customers: governments, insurance companies, news agencies, local governments, financial companies, agriculture companies, oil, energy companies, NGOs, scientific research organizations, all sorts of things. And we've been adding more and more sophisticated satellites to our constellation, getting them to be better and better over the years. We've launched over 500 satellites, which used to be the largest constellation that anyone had launched until Starlink came along. This interview is coming to you over Starlink, by the way. And so I've been at Planet, and I worked there for the last 8 years, mostly on optics and satellite payloads and satellite systems engineering and design of satellites. We design them, we manufacture them, we buy launches on all sorts of different rocket providers, now mostly SpaceX, but we've launched with practically everybody. And then we operate the satellites, but that's all cost centers. The profit centers is the data that comes down, and trying to monetize that data and to the largest array of markets and customers. So recently I've pivoted from working primarily on payloads and instruments and satellite systems engineering to a little bit more in the software realm, computer vision, machine vision, AI. The reason there is that we bring down, I don't know, many terabytes every day of images. It's far too many images for anyone to look at. And so one of the questions of the hour is how can we use machines and the various advances that have been happening over the decades and more recently over the last few weeks in machine learning and AI to answer the questions that people really want to answer using the data that we gather, rather than simply having people look at millions of images that they don't have time to look at. So there is the capsule summary of my professional career. Now, along the way, I did some work in immunology, which we can, if we get into the COVID topic, we can talk about that from a sort of immunological perspective.
Hey guys, really quick break. Please consider supporting our podcast. We're entirely listener supported through patreon.com. This allows us to not plaster ads all over these podcasts. We don't have any sponsors. Nobody's telling us what to do, and we really want to keep it that way. So please consider just giving a couple of dollars and joining our group over at patreon.com. We meet up once a week. We discuss all the ways in which to make this a better project. And ultimately, that is going to be the success or failure of what we're doing here. If you don't have any money to give right now, that's totally cool. Just engage with us. Come over, hang out at Discord, share the podcast with somebody that you think would like it in your life, and leave a comment down below. We do our best to engage with these comments as much as we can possibly keep up with. And Discord and Facebook are also places where we can talk. But we want to hear your ideas, and we want to learn how to make this a better and better project. Back to the conversation.
I've also, been active in some kind of weird alternative communities like community living in San Francisco. I've been a member of many community houses where a group of people band together and rent a nicer house than they could afford individually, and live together and govern together. And I've done a number of those. I've been involved with a little bit with some of the peripherally with some of the psychedelic communities in the Bay Area, and knew a lot of the pioneers in that space, some of who are now gone because I started that in the 90s. And then, now post-COVID, there's been all this fragmentation and all these micro communities that have emerged online. And I think I'm part of some of the similar ones that you are from the look of things. Anyway, that's my history. Hope I didn't take too long.
No, not at all. And I wonder, with such a breadth of topics under your belt, is there a set of questions that feel like they're the most mysterious things in the world to you? Like, is there some kind of overarching question that drives you?
There are a few questions that I keep returning to. I would say that, it depends whether it's like there's questions of curiosity and there's questions of import, and they overlap, but they're not necessarily the same sets of questions. In the curiosity realm, some of the things which have fascinated me the most are in the fairly technical areas of mathematics and applied physics. So the nature of quantum theory, which I've actually published some stuff on with some colleagues, although that was kind of outside my main work thread. The nature of information processing in the human mind and how it relates to particularly math and information processing in machines. That's been more of a recent focus for me because of the work I've been doing on machine vision and stuff like that at work. And then perhaps an overlapping question that's both of intellectual curiosity and, global impact is the nature of the good. Like, what is good? What are we actually trying to optimize for? If we can come to any agreement on that, like, what do we want, and what do we, that leads into all these questions, like the nature of suffering and the nature of joy and the nature of beauty, and so that's pretty fuzzy stuff, but nonetheless, I'm not a philosopher, but I've become recently quite fascinated with the nature of consciousness, that sort of thing. I'm not obsessed with these things like philosophical things, but they definitely, when you're trying to figure out what's important, you just can't help but go there a little bit. And then I would, sorry to just ramble here, I'll bring it down, I'll land in a second. I've also, because I'm older than you, I had some health issues, and so I got really into nutrition, and I completely turned my health around, which is then what kind of led me into that, with the knowledge of molecular biology, then led me to be a bit of a COVID contrarian, which we can talk about. And then it also led me, though, interestingly enough, into the field of regenerative agriculture, which I became obsessed with because I'm like, hey, I'm into nutrition. Nutrition relates to the food system, which is all screwed up. There's these things that people are developing to make a much more beneficial food system on many different simultaneous axes: economic, biological, ecological, nutritional, civilizational, all these things. Like, we can do, arguably, we can do agriculture in all its forms, ranching included, in much better ways than we currently do. So I became obsessed with that. And then that overlaps because I work at a remote sensing data company. Like, oh, we can do something for regenerative agriculture. We don't just have to sell our data to Monsanto and people like that. So those are some range of things that I wake up in the morning and think about. Mostly I think about math things that can be applied to all of this stuff.
I love it.
Is there really any ambiguity in what is good, or is there dissent amongst the humans about where we should be aiming towards, or is it an alignment issue with our superstructures, our financial structures, our governance structures, our social structures being misaligned to what we truly want? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, of course I do. I'm not enough of a philosopher or a political scientist or economist to really answer that with any degree of certitude, but I think that there is probably both. There certainly are alignment problems, absolutely, and perverse incentives and all that sort of thing. But then there's also, like, the natural diversity of human opinion, human priorities. Like, I mean, for some people, their well-being and their family's well-being is like a number one, and you can't really necessarily fault them for that, but it doesn't necessarily align all that well with larger circles of compassion, or whatever they call it. And then I think people probably do disagree about what's important. Like, my go-to trio for what's important is, I say, truth, beauty, and the light. And I got that from a friend of mine. And what I mean by truth, beauty, and the light, because it rolls off the tongue easily, like, that's what we want to optimize for. Truth is kind of self-explanatory. Beauty is harder to define, but nonetheless a pretty well-known concept.
Like harmony or something like that? Like,
harmony would be included, beautiful world, nature would be included, beautiful architecture, beautiful people who are healthy and happy. And then the truth, beauty, and the light. The light is the love light. The light is love. The light is, love for each other, love for ourselves, love for all creatures, love for creation, if you want to call it that. The universe, the biosphere, whatever you want to name it. So I think that if people focused on truth, beauty, and the light, we would be all headed in approximately the right direction.
Truth is a really interesting one, because when people talk about truth, it's often like they're pointing at somebody else, but I feel like it really starts with yourself, with respect to yourself. Like, it's very difficult to expect truth from other people if you're not even honest with yourself, which is a very, very difficult thing to master.
Yes, that is certainly the case. And one might argue that if we can't be truthful with ourselves, how can we be truthful with anybody? Like, if we don't even know what's going on within our own mind, how can we know what's going on anywhere with any, like certainly within someone else's mind, or in any complicated, distant system? I mean, you can know whether it's hot outside without having a great deal of introspection, but more complicated questions would seem to be very hard to answer if you can't even answer them about your own nature. So yeah, right. Maybe there's a fourth thing we have to add into Truth, Beauty, and the Light, which is some kind of introspection and appreciation for one's own miraculous existence.
Truth, beauty, light, and insight.
Yeah. I mean, they start to, they're like, in math terms, they're not linearly independent components, so they start to, smush into each other.
It's you mentioned psychedelics earlier, and I've noticed that there's essentially two types of people I run into. One who's not at all interested in psychedelics, and one who thinks it's the best thing. It's a transformative experience that all humans should put themselves through. But it's interesting that when you talk to the people who are very opposed to psychedelics, they seem to express some real trepidation with facing some aspects of themselves. Like, oh, I got all this weight, this baggage that I don't want to have to dive back into that stuff, right? I just encounter that over and over again. It's like, but I got all this stress.
Well, okay, fair enough. I mean, that's understandable, and that is a danger, right? If someone who's disturbed or traumatized or suffering, or has maybe kind of gotten that under control, takes psychedelics, especially in an unsupervised, setting, they can end up having a bad trip and get worse. That is certainly a danger. But, on the other hand, we have all this breakthrough stuff with psychedelics to treat PTSD and depression and
addiction
and couples therapy and just aiding in psychotherapy. And so, it seems like under the right guidance, in the right dosage, in the right setting, with the right protocols, it is actually fairly miraculous, but it's not necessarily a panacea, right? It's not going to help everybody absolutely all the time. And
I feel like a lot of people's first experience with psychedelics is in some social context, which is totally inappropriate, right? They'll smoke weed for the first time at a party in high school, and then they spend the whole party staring at themselves in the mirror and freaking out because, they got all these issues with themselves that they didn't realize that they had been sitting on, and that's it pretty much, right? They're not like they're turned away from that experience because it's the set and setting. Is that set and settings?
Well, I was actually thinking about this in a slightly different direction, which is like people are turned away from it, but it's also that the influence of psychedelics to me seems a little bit destabilizing on a society. Because I feel like there's few people that are able to take them inside the set and setting, which is the constraints of a day job that they might not like. And so I feel like there's something significant about the fact that right around the time that all of these compounds were becoming really, really popular, they became outlawed.
Yeah.
And now
that was terrible. I mean, look, this is a deep topic, as you know. This is the sort of Tim Leary splitting with his colleagues over this, and they were saying this should be done in a controlled way. It should be brought into the elites, with us trained psychiatrists who are experienced in this thing. And Leary allegedly, who I met a few times but wasn't really a friend with, but I was a friend with some of these other guys. He was like, no, we have to just give it to everybody. And so he started doing that because LSD was cheap and easy to make, relatively speaking. And then there was this huge backlash, and he was imprisoned, and he escaped from prison, and all this standard story. But then they were made illegal, and then there was the Analogs Act, and all kinds of molecules were made illegal that didn't even exist yet. And now we're slowly clawing our way back to a more sensible situation with. But again, it's going through the elites. It's like going through these programs with university professors and FDA trials and kind of meticulous by the book stuff. I mean, there's also a lay counseling movement where you can get psychedelic therapy on the down low, but leaving that aside, and then there's the whole, ayahuasca churches and stuff like that. I mean, I am kind of extreme about this stuff. I don't mean this literally, but I mean this approximately. I don't think that psychedelics should be legalized. I think psychedelics should be mandatory. And I don't mean that like everyone should have to take them, frequently. Certainly not. But I think that in general, it would be on balance useful for most people to have had at least one psychedelic experience once they're old enough, once they're stable enough, in a situation that's correctly set up so that you minimize the danger of things going awry.
What do you think what do you think people would get out of that experience? Like, okay, so that's a more superficial question than the one that I mean to ask. I mean, more, what do you think that it is about the psychedelic experience that is so important that it ought to be not mandatory? I think that's a better version.
Well, earlier on in our pre-conversation, I mentioned Graham Hancock, and I'll just say that at least my position is arguably not quite as extreme as his, but I enjoyed hearing him say, I think on Rogan, that he thinks before you can be elected to be like prime minister or president of any country, you should have done at least 12 ayahuasca trips. And so that's sort of a different version of the same meme. But what do I think is sorry, your question was what is so important, but then you rephrased it and I forgot.
I think that's it. What do you think that someone gets from that experience that is so important that it ought to be mandatory?
Well, I think there's a lot of things people can get and do get, and different people get different ones, and different people need different ones. But certainly one of them is you get the understanding, at least for a time, that the world or the universe or consciousness is so much more than you thought. It's so much bigger than you thought. There's so much more to it than you thought, to nature, to the mind, to the universe. These are mind expanding drugs. So they get you out of your and at the flip side of that is that you learn that your own ego, your own self, is really, miraculous as it may be, it's just so much less of the big picture than you thought it was. Most people are walking around in their egos, like in their self, all the time. That's kind of their whole picture is just this one they've developed with their bubble around them, and this is the inside, this is the outside, and metaphorically speaking. And you learn, it pops that bubble, right? So that's the expansion part. The other part is that, at least for some of them, like the empathogens, they give you this love feeling, and you can use that to heal all kinds of conflicts, or at least alleviate the conflicts with friends you've had falling out with partners you might be in trouble with, or even with your own self. So now, okay, so in a way, we could say that we have truth, beauty, and the light, and psychedelics certainly can amplify beauty. Like you see beauty in nature, and you see beauty in other people, and all this kind of stuff. And some of them amplify love. They open your heart, at least some of them. Now, as for truth, that's the bigger question. Like, do they show you things that are true, or what does that even mean? And I think that, arguably, they sometimes show you some things that are true, like you're not the only game in town, and, there's a much bigger world out there, which everyone knows in theory, but in terms of really knowing it in their bones, there's nothing like a stiff dose of psychedelics to remind you of that thing which you claim to know but don't actually know, that the universe is much bigger than you. So I think that reveals truth, at least for the time. Then there's this whole other aspect of, okay, you've you've had this great realization, and then you come down and like it's back to work and back to the daily grind. And so does it really stick? That's a whole other thing. I think that it does for a lot of people. Like a lot of people will say that their psychedelic experience, I'm sure you've heard this, like people who have a psychedelic experience, is particularly a positive one that's guided and correctly dosed and with counseling and all this, they will report it as being like one of the top 3 experiences of their life. Like being in love, having a child, taking psychedelics, like that's it.
Yeah, I don't think that they necessarily do show you the truth, though, too, is the problem. I think this is underpins the paranoia experience that a lot of people have, right? Like, you could definitely find yourself fixated on a problem and spend 5 hours worrying about something that you didn't need to be worrying about at the same time.
This is true, and this is why it helps, I suppose, although I've never really done it, it helps to have a guide or a therapist. I mean, I've kind of gotten into it sort of the more, I wouldn't say traditional, but the more like vanilla way that you talked about. I experimented when I was a teen, which I probably shouldn't have done, and then I dropped it for a long time, and then I experimented as a young adult and was with people who knew what they were doing, so that was kind of good. But it was still kind of recreational. And then finally I fell in with a crowd of people who were serious investigators of the phenomenon. And although we didn't do a lot of guided trips together, we did talk a lot about it and have some experiences together. And I adopted, because I actually got kind of, I had an affinity for it, and I had a situation in my life where I could do it semi-regularly, like every few months. And so, but I was right there with you, where it was like, how do I know that I'm not just wasting my time with all this false profundity? So I got into writing down questions before I took a trip, and then looking at the questions when I was tripping. And you can't really write stuff down when you're tripping. Your coordination tends to be bad and your concentration tends to be bad. But I would speak into a voice recorder. And then after I was sober again, I would go back and review the questions and the things I put into the voice recorder. And it's like, sure enough, it's like, listen to myself in the recording, and I'm like, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. Oh, this right here, that's pretty good. So
I like that.
I think that kind of thing can really be helpful, sort of looking at it as like almost like a scientist, like you're going exploring in this new place and you're going to see all these things you've never seen before, but that doesn't mean they're all important.
What are the kinds of questions that you would be asking?
Well, they certainly evolved. I mean, some of them were personal. What do I want? What do I love? Who am I? Some of them were more scientific-like, such as, what is the nature of consciousness? Is at least the whole living universe conscious in some sense, either in bits and pieces or all together? Are there extra dimensions, informally speaking, that are important? I should go back and look at my list of questions. I'm a little bit tongue-tied right now.
No, but I think that's a really, really good advice in general, is to have a plan and have some action. I mean, people call it intention, right? Which is kind of a wish-washy word, but it's critical. I personally, at this point in my life, I'm really not interested in any of those experiences unless I'm in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, and I'm completely away from civilization, and I'm just completely open to, and I have gone in with some questions, like you say, or I'm going to contemplate how the electron shell works, or I'm going to contemplate how my marriage could be better, or I'm going to contemplate this piece of music I'm working on, right? It's like I definitely have to have that set out before me. Otherwise, I find that, and this might be true in non-psychedelic contexts too, but if you don't have some aim at any given point in time, especially if you have a propensity towards thought, if that's kind of what you do as a thinking person, right, then you're just going to chew on whatever surfaces, right? It could be this whatever. It could be like, oh, I have this itch here. Oh no, it's probably a tumor or something, right? It could be like anything silly. But if you don't have a plan for what you're going to work on a given day, this could just be completely outside of psychedelics too. But if you don't have some set of goals for what you're going to put your mind on, the mind will just tend towards anything that it can find because it needs something to chew on, which can be really dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, on the other hand, just like when you go hiking, sometimes it's nice to have a destination and sometimes it's not. You know, one might think that applies to psychedelic hiking as well.
I just think that
But
it's
there's
hard to, excuse me, I think that it can be really hard to get these sorts of experiences more broadly applied because one of the things that I think is important for a society is the fundamental belief that everything is more or less laid out and that we've kind of solved the mysteries and that as long as you perform the functions that have been granted to you by the structures in which you've come up, that you will reach some level of success that you will be satisfied with, and that'll kind of be the arc of a life. And when you start to...
Well, that can all be true and arguably is, but it doesn't mean that's all there is, right?
But the question becomes, do you feel like you have the luxury of time to be able to explore the things that are beyond what you already have granted to you? And I feel like that's what's really like my brother is very much against psychedelics, against any kind of he doesn't even really drink, and he's not particularly straight edge about it. He just doesn't have any curiosity towards it. And I'm always trying to figure out if that's because he has a worldview that he needs to maintain, or if it's because he just lacks some aspect of curiosity and he's perfectly content with the landscape as it is.
Yeah, I guess there's if it works, don't fix it kind of a paradigm. If you're happy, then why rock the boat? Fair enough. I mean, there's various ways to approach that gently, such as a low dose. Not like a microdose. I think that's a whole other topic. But like you don't have to blow someone's mind the very first time if they just take a small dose of LSD or similar hallucinogen. They'll see beautiful things. It won't completely shatter their worldview. And so then they'll be like, oh, I don't have to be so afraid of this. This is interesting. Maybe I want to do more. And then as Tim Leary says, when in doubt, double the dose. And so there's that approach. But yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily for everybody. So when I say they should be mandatory, I don't really mean that. But what I do mean is that, look, there's a lot of cultures where it is mandatory or was, right? And you would, by the way, no matter how busy your tribe was, you would go out into the woods or the jungle or whatever, the desert, whatever it might be, for some days. And these would be the days where you communed with God with oftentimes a sacred plant involved in the communion. And so this is a tradition that seems to have arisen across different cultures. And one might argue that there's a reason for that. Now, it's not like your average person would be doing this frequently. They might just do it once as a coming of age kind of thing. But nonetheless, the shamans might do it frequently, but that's another story. Which gets us into another thing that I wanted to bring up. So from our pre-conversation, I tended to gather that you two are somewhat contrarian to mainstream narratives on a number of topics, or at least receptive to contrarian narratives on a number of topics.
We're dissatisfied with mainstream narratives on a number of topics, and we're very curious for alternative solutions to these problems.
Yeah, so that's a big field, but I want to say one thing about it, which might set us off in some interesting directions. This is a realization that I had during COVID, because during COVID, I was pretty contrarian from the very beginning. And the reason for that was weird. I mean, not all that weird. I'm not alone in this, but it was that I had already been made aware that the food and pharma industries had, quote unquote, been lying to us for a long time about certain foods and about certain drugs. Like they had been promoting a low-fat, high-carb diet as a health solution for decades, and it was a disaster, and they just wouldn't stop. And they have been, so that's kind of the food industry. Then but also the Food and Drug Administration. We often kind of ignore the F in FDA. And then I also became aware, because I was, as I said, I was unhealthy, and my doctor's solution was to put me on a statin. And I was looking into this, and I was like, no way, I'm going to try it my way first. I'm going to try carbohydrate restriction and intermittent fasting and this, that, and the other thing. And it totally worked. Like, I had all my markers down to, optimal levels for someone decades younger than me.
Well, there's a lot of stories like this, right? Where people will do a diet that is completely contrary to all advice, right? Like red meat. There's an entire website full of people that follow the carnivore diet, where they say the magical health, I cleared my psoriasis, I had autoimmune disease, I had all these things, I completely cut out processed foods, sugars, went all meat and like fruit, and now I'm fine.
Look, we're totally on the same page on this stuff. I mean, I think, like, I agree with most of that stuff. I mean, every anecdote doesn't mean that,
sure,
like, correlation does not.
But a page of like 6,000 anecdotes where people are just passionately, they show pictures, and it's just like.
I'm like, surely there has to be a point where anecdotes become data when you have.
Well, there's a thing a good friend of mine, Dan Barquet, says, which I love, which is that correlation does not equal causation, but it's correlated with causation.
That's good.
So, anyway, yes, but my point was just to say that, because I'm going to tell a little story here, and then maybe we can riff on it. So I had already become quite skeptical of the powers that be and their diet and nutrition advice, and it seemed like there were contrarians who actually had information and results that were as good, or perhaps way better, kind of almost antithetical to the mainstream narratives from the government agencies and the universities even. And then there were similar things with certain pharmaceutical interventions, like statins, like cardiac stents, arguably angioplasties. Like, these things look like they were not the great things that they were made out to be. They were certainly great for the interventional cardiologists and the drug companies, but as for whether they're great for the population that was being arguably overtreated, that didn't seem to be very clear. And so, and then, as there was this focus on, like, say with statins, for instance, cardiac outcomes versus all-cause mortality, and you get certain debates there about what are the right metrics. But so I was skeptical of those things: pharmaceuticals, surgery, in many cases, nutritional advice from the government agencies and the industries that have captured them. And so when COVID came along, I was like, okay, you don't expect me to believe you guys just like from the start on this, because you kind of have fucked things up for decades in a number of really important areas. I'm pretty sure of that. So, like, I'm going to be skeptical of what you say about this. So I was skeptical. And so I was skeptical about masks, and I was skeptical about lockdowns, and I was skeptical about natural immunity. And then I mean, not skeptical about natural immunity, but skeptical about their skepticism and rejection of natural immunity. And then I was skeptical and hesitant about vaccination with the new vaccines. And okay, so we can, each of those is like a whole argument rabbit hole, and we don't really need to go there again. But the thing is that this is sort of the point I'm getting to. What struck me after all the years, and then all the quote unquote conspiracy theories turning out to be quite possibly true, lab leaks, masks don't work, like all the things I said, like all the things that would get you banned and get you ostracized and get you ridiculed and get you removed from your social group if you were contrarian, they're now, it's like there's a certain, let's just say,
Well,
greater
there's a
acceptance of
tendency now.
bodies.
You actually see people who didn't say jack during the pandemic are now coming out and being like, "Well, I always knew all along." And it's like, "Well,
Well,
that's
yeah.
weird. Why didn't you say so?"
Well, look, okay, why didn't you say so? Because you'd get canceled and lose your job or your friends
Sure.
or your family if you said so. Another reason is that you didn't know. Like even me, at the beginning they made it seem like it was the zombie apocalypse, and they made everyone so afraid that we all started off pretty afraid, and then different people sort of popped out of that fear in different amounts at different times. But the other, I mean, and a lot of people they might have said they always say this. I always thought, I always said, and then people will like post some tweet that they had about how vaccinated people should be, how unvaccinated people should be put in jail. But look, people can change their minds. Like that's what we want, right?
Mhm.
We want people to change their minds, and if they have to pretend like that was always what they thought. If as long as they're willing to change their minds, I'm willing to grant them some forgiveness. Now if they were busy violating people's rights and forcing them to undergo experimental dangerous procedures and devastating the economy out of with bad ideas, bad information, drunk on power, that's another story. Those people should be held accountable. But your average reporter or something like that, I don't know. I'm not one of these. I don't believe in an amnesty for COVID. COVIDians, like COVID panic people,
Doomers.
but COVID doomers. But I do believe in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission rather than a Nuremberg situation, except in very few cases where I think arguably one might wish to hold certain.
It's really scary if we don't do something like that. If we don't actually address these on a national platform, what went wrong, what was crazy, where the capture points happened. If we don't discuss those, it's going to just keep happening.
Yeah, it certainly is. There's a danger that things like it keep happening. I think the virus thing may have played itself out in the sense that there's a lot of skeptical people now, and if a virus comes along that's going to induce the same amount of fear that COVID did, it's going to have to be really deadly, like not just slightly deadly like COVID. It's going to have to be like really deadly. And all I can say is, we better get our act together on the gain of function research prohibitions so that we don't create something like that.
I wanted you to finish the larger thought that you were trying to land
the
this
larger
thought.
Yes, I will. Okay, here's the larger thought. So what was surprising to me, I travel and associate mostly with very intelligent, open-minded people. And I was utterly shocked at how many of them, such a large fraction of them, were acted what I thought was closed-minded and unintelligent around COVID. And, some of them have fallen away from that, but still, there's a great degree of polarization. And I found myself, always in the contrarian camp and self-censoring, to be frank, in many cases, not completely. And I was just like, how can it be that 80% of my people don't see or don't even consider, won't even allow for discussion the contrarian points of view? And I realized, I've always been a contrarian, and this was just sort of the most high stakes example that had come along in my lifetime. And I was like, why am I a contrarian? I'm not a and I had to look inwards to answer this, because I realized I'm not a contrarian because I like to argue. I don't like it that much. And I'm certainly not a contrarian because I like to be in conflict with people, and particularly my friends. I don't like that at all. And not a contrarian because I want to be that guy who is always taking the other side just to so his voice is different. And I'm not trying to be different necessarily for its own sake. I'm like, why am I this way? What am I getting out of it? And what I realized is that I think I'm wired for it. And I think that explains why 80% or 85 or whatever the number is of people aren't. And I think that what's going on is just a hypothesis, but what I think is going on is that in order for humans, like in early tribes, in prehistory to survive, they had to be a tribe. That meant they had to follow the leader. If they didn't follow the leader, however that leader came to its position, if you didn't follow the leader, there's like no point to being a tribe. Like nothing, you can't get anything done. You can't work as a group if everybody's just doing things kind of according to their own whims. You have to fall in line behind the leader as a group in order to work as a group. And so most people have been selected to do that evolutionarily. But there's a skinny little tail of people where there's arguably an evolutionary advantage to having a few people in the tribe who go wander off in a different direction and look for new things and find new things and try to bring some of the cool things they find back to the tribe. Because if you don't have that, nothing ever changes. Nobody ever gets, nobody ever gains in there. Nobody ever finds out what's over the next hill or how to build something new. So I think that a certain number of those people, but a small minority, are kept around by evolution, if you will, because it is advantageous. But they can never be the majority, because if they were the majority, the whole group would kind of go fragment. Now, the last thing I want to say about this is that there's another flip side to this, which is, why am I a contrarian in many cases? Because I have a lot of smart friends. And if they're busy on the mainstream narrative, looking over here on the big hump in the curve where most people are looking, I'm like, I'm not such a genius that I'm going to go where everybody else is looking and find something new and valuable. That is highly unlikely. I might be better off going where very few people are looking on the tail of the curve, because at least nobody's looking there, and so I might find something useful. So those are, this is sort of a bittersweet message. It's like, why didn't majority of my friends wake up? Because they're not wired to look at contrarian opinions. And that is both satisfying in that it explains it, and dissatisfying in that it seems to be kind of like a fact of nature.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it was really important in human migration too. Like, if you look at the spread of peoples, it's very easy to imagine that you'd always, like, the way that humans spread out along the coastlines from the earliest days must have required that there was some group of people that had this fundamental instinct to do something differently and move themselves. And then there must have been enough of a population to go with them too. Like, this 15% makes a lot of sense to me, because you have one guy who's like, hey, I actually think there's probably better fishing that way. And everybody's like, no, dude, like, we're super happy here.
Yeah,
like,
well, that's the thing. But if the guy comes back with a 8 times as many fish one day,
but maybe he doesn't come back.
Yeah, I think that's exactly.
Or maybe he doesn't come back.
That's what Shiloh's, I think, right about, which is that if you have a moment in time where humans are radiating across the planet, then you have constantly a new place where you can go. And if you make the bet that it's better over the hill, you take a big enough group with you and you just leave. But we're at a point right now where you can't really leave. And I think that a lot of the tension and a lot of the conflict comes down to it being a fight over power exerted over a limited territory, because we're on Earth. There's the, the Axis and the Allies or whatever. And the fight.
There's a lot of uninhabited territory on the Earth, but it's kind of either spoken for or agreed that it can't be spoken for, like the open sea, or Antarctica. But you're certainly true metaphorically as well. Like, although the podcast ecosystem and the emerging media ecosystem has thrown a monkey wrench into this thing, even the domain of discourse has been colonized, and to a large extent, there's power centers and authority centers and gatekeepers, right? So it's all true. Thank God for the podcast protocols, which are to first order not censorable, as you know. Like, it might be a pain in the butt if YouTube or whoever bans you, but it doesn't mean that no one can see your stuff.
You're going to have to explain RSS to a lot of people who don't know what it is in order for that to catch on. But I do think that fundamentally you're right. Because each podcast has an RSS feed, and that can't be...
It can have many. It can have many, right?
But these are uncensorable ways of getting to the source because it's... I mean, couldn't they technically censor RSS?
That's a big topic. It depends what platform you're on. It depends if you're on a laptop or a smartphone and what operating system it's running. It depends on your ISP and your government and your willingness to break the law. It depends on a lot of things.
I mean, one thing that's completely blown my mind by starting my own podcast that I would have never expected, especially if I go back to the early days of starting a podcast, you know, the model is get the biggest audience that you possibly can, and then you can sustain yourself, essentially, right? You sell ads or do whatever you do. But it hasn't proved to be true for us because we have a relatively small audience, but what we've done very carefully is retain people that are super valuable for building it into a better podcast. And what we've done in doing that is we've actually found through the Patreon model, that we don't actually need an enormous audience. We just need an audience that really cares about the project, which is kind of like mind-bending to me because, you know, we're just at the early days of being able to make a living doing this. And it's not because we have millions of followers. It's because we have a few hundred followers that really want to make it happen. Plus, like, you know, whatever thousands happen to be just tuning and listening. But the dedicated core is what it really matters. And I think the reason that they support it is because we're genuinely curious about these questions. We're not trying to like, oh, well, aliens are popular. Let's do a bunch of shows about aliens. We're like, no, we are interested in this, that, or the other thing. And we're going to just keep asking questions on those things. And by getting close to that people that support us and really spending time every week hanging out, we do a Zoom call with our patrons every week. We just got off the phone with them right before this.
Nice.
And we're really trying to understand what it is where the intersection of those dedicated people is with our interests and really trying to like build off of that nucleus as opposed to like trying to capture this huge audience that's interested in this sort of, you know, lowest common denominator interest base, which a lot of people do. And I'm sure it works out for them. They can sell ads and all that stuff, but we don't have any ads, right?
That's really heartwarming and informative because, as I mentioned, I was dabbling in the idea of doing a podcast, and I don't. But I think that's great to know, and not just to know for me because I'm probably not going to do it. But it's good to know that that these sort of like, how do you want to call it? Like, I don't mean to belittle it, but like cottage industries. Like, it's good to know that someone can make a living doing this without trying to
like take over the world
or go to the lowest common denominator, race to the bottom kind of, you know, showmanship or audience capture. Hey, I hate to say this, Shiloh, is it possible to take a 2-minute break because I would really want to get a beverage?
Yeah, for sure. I could use the bathroom. I mean, I can't even like explain how much that blew my mind when I like this experience of doing this podcast. I would have never ever thought this is how the world of media could work because I had ambitions to be a musician for most of my life. I wanted to be a professional musician. I tried to do that for years. I toured with bands. I slept in cars. You know, it was really hard. And like I played like some incredible shows and made a lot of records, but it always seemed to me that you needed this enormous like 1% captured huge audience, basically, you know,
right?
And it's just not the case with what we're doing right now, and it blows my mind every day. It's crazy. I mean, I would have never thought it.
That's a really positive message. I mean, it's a positive message in one regard. It has its downside, as I'm sure you know, and what I mean by that is that, you know, we talk about the polarization and fragmentation that we have in our world, and I'm not accusing you of being polarizing or fragmenting in your podcast, but what I mean is that, you know, if everybody is busy getting their information from sharing it with an audience of, you know, a few hundred, then it's hard to know how we're going to reach any common picture of what's going on.
The audience, I guess, like I might have been confusing. So our audience is probably tens of thousands, actually, but the core group that supports us is more important than the wider audience in some sense, because that is who actually like sustains it, like keeps the lights on in our studio, I guess is what I'm saying. Like the audience
Right.
grows for sure, and that's also inspiring and it's good. But by virtue, the cool thing about podcasts is you call up people like you or people who are industry leaders or thought like at the front of some academic forefront or some alternative world, and they open up their entire audience, and all of a sudden they find out about these other people, and it's like this big web weaving project that's like
Yep.
so
Interesting.
yeah. So I think the capture thing is, I think it's more of a problem, or sorry, not the capture. What's the word for it? The narrowing, the siloing is
Right.
maybe more of a problem with traditional media. But I see this web weaving as being a solution to that on balance.
That's very interesting. Hierarchical small worlds. Go ahead.
I wonder why it's so important for people to not be siloed. Like I always hear people talking about it as, the siloing of information and the siloing of perspectives and these echo chambers are bad. But I'm not yet totally convinced that it is bad, because if you think about what a community is a group of people that have some constrained culture that gives them something that they all agree on. And there's things that you can't
agree.
silo, right? Like, at least in my mind, there's some fundamental things that you can't silo because you're going to end up looking to the same resources to figure out how chemistry works or how biology works or whatever. And then
True enough.
only when you get to the very, very edges of it, you start to get to a place where then people will branch off. But that's even the case in academics, right? So of the other groups.
I mean, academics has had a siloing problem for arguably a long time, and people will even kind of flip it and say that the real progress in academia happens at the boundaries between disciplines. And, that to some extent is arguably true. I think that the answer actually is in the web that Chalo was talking about, which is that, yes, you have communities, but you don't want to have communities with no connections to other communities. And if you have a mix of a large number of local connections that are that make the community a community with a lot of connections between it, you also have to have arguably long distance connections. Different people have to be connected to other groups, and that's like a general mathematical thing called small worlds, or navigable small worlds. And I think that's what we're going to see, right? Like, you're going to find that some of your audience members, are subscribed to some very different podcasts too, and are a member of that community as well, arguably. And so this is very interesting. The connections become pretty strong, and what that means is there's not actually that much distance between any two communities. That's like the 6 degrees of separation, that thing. So,
and I think it gives people something to explore, because when you are in this massive ecosystem like Twitter or something, there's a lot of good reasons why Twitter is important. You wrote this post on your Substack a while ago where you were like, look, I actually think that it's a good thing that we have this microblogging platform that everybody participates in. You made an argument for why it is deeply valuable, and I agree. But at the same point, I think that it's also really deeply valuable for people to be able to wander between places and to construct this assembly of things that they are interested in, which are more distinct from one another, because wandering a unified cultural landscape is pretty alienating, because there's never a sense of home. Like, a home is a niche, and if there's no niche, then you can't really settle in because you're just buffeted by the winds.
right. Yeah. Well, again, I think that, people on Twitter, for instance, like, followers tend to follow each other, but not entirely. Like, everybody's got outside voices, or most people have outside voices that are different from other people's outside voices that they're looking at. So I think it'll work itself out. I think it kind of has the architecture of a brain, whether it's the podcast ecosystem or the Twitter networks. Like, it's kind of like the brain. There's a lot of local connectivity, and then there's some amount of non-local connectivity, which is it's all important for the coherent operation. Centralized control and like having just like 3 media networks is probably not the way to go, but obviously having a million networks with no connections between them is also not the way to go.
It's also really hard to both attract people and to sustain a good faith conversation with somebody who's completely oppositional to you. Like it's just very hard. When we started this podcast, we thought, okay, we'll just only call up people who disagree with our extant, solution set to X, Y, and Z problems. But it's really hard to get those people to respond to emails because they look at your stuff and they're just like, oh, well, I'm not going to talk to you. Like you're not in my crew, essentially. And then once if you do get those people in the room, it's very hard to keep them, like, to massage their shoulders enough that they're comfortable enough to have a good faith conversation, as opposed to just reciting the dogma that you're already aware of in the first place, and really try to pick at the details.
Who's fairly good at that, in my opinion, at least in some regards, and someone I admire a great deal. Do you know who Glenn Lowry is?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, he runs a podcast, and he's a professor of history.
Correct. Of economics. Yeah. But he's sort of one of the black conservatives, and so I have a soft spot for that, but for various reasons. But one of the things he does is he routinely on his show, whether he's interviewing someone he disagrees with or whether he's just talking with a friend, and they're discussing someone they disagree with, he will say, okay, let me steelman their position. Here's how I would put it. And, we all know about steelmanning and how important that is, but he actually does it. Like, he hasn't given up, he continually does this with the viewpoints that even though he disagrees with it, a lot of times he can really cogently summarize it, even to the point where he's like, well, I've kind of convinced myself. They might be right. They've got a point. So that, I think, still people won't come on his show for various reasons, or maybe he won't let them, I'm not sure, but because he's pretty outspoken and aggro in many cases, because he can also go on rants where he just trashes people. But anyway, at least there's some of that going on. I'm glad to see it. Do we want to pivot and try a different topic, or how do you guys want to go?
I want to know more about the places where you disagree with the sciences and the ways in which you've encountered these scientific ideas where you figure that they're not quite right. And I'm most interested in perhaps the quantum physics side of things.
Okay, well, fine. Let's go there. All right. So I'm not alone in this, but again, it's a minority. In terms of quantum physics, in some regards, I strongly believe that quantum physics is nowhere near as mysterious and certainly not as woo-woo as a lot of people will try and claim it is.
Nice.
I believe that there are ways of understanding a great deal of quantum mechanics that are quite simple and clear, and are not even all that weird. There's an interpretation of quantum mechanics, which you may have heard of, called the Bohmian interpretation, or the de Broglie-Bohm causal interpretation. And it's a way to do quantum mechanics that doesn't involve any of this mind of the observer. It doesn't involve denying the existence of reality. It doesn't involve self-contradictory concepts like a wave-particle duality. It doesn't involve collapse of the wave function, actually. And yet it's arguably equivalent mathematically in every one of its predictions to the standard quantum theory, because it basically is just another way of taking the same equations, putting them in an alternative polar form, essentially, and looking at that. And so I've for many decades I've been quite infatuated with the Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now, I don't view it as like the one true way, that it's right and everything else is wrong. I view it as a way to analyze certain problems and think about certain things that's very useful. And sometimes it's more useful to use another interpretation, like many worlds interpretation, or even the more standard collapse interpretations, because in some sense they're all equivalent in terms of their predictions, or largely so. And then I go even farther, and there's a sort of fringe of the fringe, which in the Bohmian world, of which there are, thousands of people who go along with it, or who appreciate it at any rate, there's a much less well-known version that involves substituting the non-locality of quantum mechanics, which is one of the big sort of, if not mysteries, then counterintuitive, non-classical aspects of it. It's there in the Bohm interpretation too, quantum non-locality, all the things that EPR correlations, entanglement, all this stuff. That's in the Bohm theory too. But there's this other version of it where you don't need all that stuff. You don't need all these extra dimensions. You don't need all this non-locality. But what you have to accept in this case is that the future can influence present or the past. And once you allow for future boundary conditions to affect the current quantum state, then you only need 3 dimensions plus time. You don't need any extra dimensions at all to derive quantum theory. And so that's a number of people have worked in this area. Probably the clearest thinker in this area is named Roderick Sutherland. And he has this way of looking at it. Again, it's equivalent to quantum theory, standard quantum theory. So it's not like one's right and one's wrong. It's just another way of thinking. But this idea that the future can influence the past, I mean, we normally have no problem thinking the past can influence the present, and hence the past can influence the future. But people just kind of say, they just won't even consider the idea that causality can be bidirectional. And if you do relax that unidirectional causality assumption, it makes a lot of things much simpler.
Is it causality or is it inevitability? Right, because I'm thinking about the way that you can describe let's say the rate of an enzyme and the rate at which you'll produce product molecules is related to the concentration of the starting reactants. And so if you start out at time 0, you know where it's going to end. And so is that just physical constraint?
Like the buildup of products influences the reaction rate. And so
even when they haven't been built up yet, because the reaction will always follow the exact same curve. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, or something more mysterious?
No, I think what you're talking about is more like the second law of thermodynamics, that if you have an out of equilibrium situation with reactant A and reactant B and no product, and you leave it alone for a while, they'll react at a certain rate and produce a certain amount of product, and eventually they'll reach equilibrium where it's balanced. But if you start out of equilibrium, it will approach equilibrium. Now that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is more like things like the so-called measurement paradox and other so-called paradoxes of quantum theory, whether it be the double slit experiment or the EPR experiment, or did I say collapse? I can't remember. But those things which normally, look, here's another way of looking at it. To do quantum mechanics on systems that are not trivial, the traditional wisdom has been, you need to throw something out from our classical intuition. You either need to throw out the existence of microphysical reality that's independent of the experimental observer, and hence bring the whole observer and their mind or their consciousness even into it. So you either need to throw away objective microphysical reality, or you need to throw away the idea of locality, that there's only 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, or you need to throw away the idea of what's called counterfactual definiteness, which means the idea that you could have done a different experiment. That's sort of the flip side of superdeterminism, that there's no way you could have done a different experiment if it's the super deterministic world. So you either need to throw away objective reality and, the sort of line between experiment and experimenter, or you need to throw away locality, or you need to throw away counterfactual definiteness, the idea that we could have chosen to do a different experiment. Or it turns out you can throw away unidirectional causality. You can keep locality, the separation of the observer and the experiment, and you can keep counterfactual definiteness as long as you allow the future to affect the present. And so you kind of have to take your choice in quantum theory of which of the intuitive common sense aspects of the universe you're going to throw away. You can't keep them all. There's theorems about this. I think the Cohen-Sprecher theorem. There's a number of different ones, but you got to, like, something's got to give to reproduce quantum mechanics, right? And so it's to some extent a question, or you have to throw away the idea that there's only one universe. Like, you can kind of get quantum mechanics by assuming an infinite number of parallel universes that are branching, right? So there's these common sense things, only one universe, experimenters not really controlling reality, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to throw one of them away. One of them is enough in general. You only have to throw one away, but you can kind of take your pick and get quantum mechanics, whichever one you throw away. And I'm just enamored with this idea that you throw away unidirectional causality, that causality can only happen from past, in the future direction. It can't happen in the backwards direction. But again, it's just a way of looking at things. Since they all produce equivalent predictions, it's not clear that one is right and the others are wrong.
I guess I'm just always obsessed with mechanism. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, what would be the...
Mechanisms defined unidirectionally is the problem.
Well,
no, it's actually not.
So. I don't think it has to be, right? Because you can imagine that this is what I'm trying to say is, like, okay, so if the future is influencing the present, which I am willing to entertain, then there has to be a mechanism by which the future can interact with the present.
Right.
And so, like, what is that? Okay.
Let me address that. So I'm not super expert on this. You might want to talk with Dr. Jack Sarfati or Roderick Sutherland or one of these people who knows more about this than I do. But I will say this, that look, even in classical electrodynamics, and even in classical mechanics for that matter, as you probably know, the equations are completely time reversal invariant. Like, if you're looking at a collision of billiard balls, if you're looking at a movie of, if you're looking at a movie of a collision of billiard balls, you cannot say which is the forward direction of the movie and which is the backwards direction of the movie, because both things could have happened. They all obey the laws of mechanics. Likewise, if you're looking at the electrodynamics, and even to some extent quantum electrodynamics, the equations are symmetrical in time.
Except for energy, right, of the billiard balls, like, they have to get hit by something in the first place, right, in order to go into motion, and then they slow down as a result of their collisions. If there's nothing to start the collision in the first place, that sets the arrow of time to make sense, right?
The trajectories.
I understand the trajectories.
It's very simple. If the trajectories of the two billiard balls come together and then they scatter off of each other, that's just as valid as if they come together in the backwards way and scatter off of each other. There's no way to tell which way the movie is playing.
If you miss the part about where the cue ball hits it,
yeah, like the movie starts with both of them in motion. They collide and scatter. Then inside of that narrowed frame,
I grasp that, but I think that the important part is the cue stick hitting, or whatever it's called.
But you see, but the problem is now you're in an open system. Like, the cue stick is, and all that stuff is coming in from outside. And so let me give you a simpler example. If you're looking at the breaking of the balls at the beginning of a billiards game, where you have them all set up in a nice triangle, and the cue ball comes in and hits, and then all these balls go scattering, right? Well, okay, technically, if you played that exactly in reverse and all the balls would come together and form up into a nice triangle, and then the cue ball would go flying away, that is valid. The mechanics of that are completely valid, respects conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, etc. But you know that doesn't happen. And that doesn't happen because of entropy, because the arrangement of the balls in a perfect triangle is an extremely low probability arrangement. And in general, you're very safe betting that things do not go from a very probable arrangement, like random balls flying around, to all of a sudden they all come together into a perfect triangle, right?
Unless you're growing like a crystal in one of those crystal kits or something.
Yeah, but then again, it's like, even so, it's increasing the entropy.
It seems to me the defining feature is still the stick hitting it, right? It's like, what caused them to fly apart is really what the mechanics of it is for me at the end of the day. I think
that you're asking the question of, are we looking inside of a closed system and satisfying ourselves with that system? Or am I interested in what happened before the boundaries of the closed system were set?
But closed systems are problematic, right? Like,
yeah, but if you can't, but nonetheless, while there is, thermodynamics and quantum mechanics for open systems, it's a lot more complicated, and you have to make a lot of assumptions. And even there, technically, it's time reversal invariant. But my only point is this: there are formulations of electrodynamics and formulations of the equations, the basic equations of physics, Newton's equations, Maxwell's equations, even the basic Schrodinger equation is time reversal invariant. Like, it's a valid solution to have waves coming in from outside impinging on a source that's just as physically valid as having waves emitted by a source. And if you look at a movie of the propagation of waves in a system, you can't tell which direction time is forward and which if the movie's playing backwards, that it's backwards, because the wave equation runs equally well in either direction of time. And so I guess what I'm saying here is there have been formulations, for instance, of electrodynamics. There's this thing called Wheeler-Feynman electrodynamics, which Richard Feynman and John Wheeler did many years ago. And this is where they said, okay, let's assume the future affects the present. Can we therefore explain certain paradoxes of electrodynamics, like, well, I'm not having it all at the tip of my mind right now, but over the decades, there have been many formulations where future boundary conditions are considered to be admittable, and it simplifies certain things. And so there's an area of physics that I am a little bit contrarian on. I enjoy looking at the idea that causality is violated in the sense of what we call retarded causality, meaning causality only comes from the past and never advanced causality that comes from the future.
Do you know the work of Carver Mead?
I do. Collective electrodynamics and that whole thing.
Yeah, and so we've had him on the show a couple of times, and he's been a really big proponent of the idea that the reason that these equations, in terms of, let's say, the emission of a photon, are time reversible is because what's actually being described is communication between the two atoms that are involved in the exchange of a photon. And so there's actually something that leaves the emitting atom as well as the receiving atom that is exchanged in the process.
And if it leaves the receiving atom, it's got to go backwards in time to affect the emitting atom, because the emitting atom it emits first, and then the thing gets received later in time. And if there's bidirectional communication, there's also a thing called the transactional interpretation, which is a little bit more hand-wavy. That's done by I forgot his name, but you can look at transactional.
It came from G.N. Lewis originally.
I think it did, but hold on.
Yeah,
let me make a last point. I think that this idea that the time reversibility is because there's the idea that, look, the photon is this little thing that gets shot out into space, and somehow, magically, the atom that's receiving knows that photon is going to arrive in the future and does something before that photon arrives, and all of a sudden you have a paradox.
Okay, I don't recall that from Mead, but it's been a while, and I mostly just remember him from his VLSI book back in the day, and then his collective electrodynamics book from a little bit more recently. But I will say this, don't forget, and here's another thing that's weird to think about, and I don't often hear this mentioned, but everybody in physics knows it's true. If a photon is emitted from atom A and absorbed by atom B later in the rest frame, in the lab frame, according to the proper time of that photon, no time has elapsed between the emission and the absorption, because any light-like spacetime interval connecting two spacetime events, emission and absorption, has zero proper interval. There's no spacetime difference between the emission event and the absorption event. Every photon is traveling on a path of zero. Every photon travels on a zero interval of space-time from its emission to its absorption. And
what is that? Can you elaborate on what that means? That doesn't totally make sense to me.
You know how in relativity, if something is going very fast, its clock ticks very slow compared to a clock at rest?
Sure.
With a photon, its clock doesn't tick at all.
I think this comes down to what a clock is and so forth, really. Like, if I took a pendulum clock into outer space, it wouldn't work at all, right? Because the gravity wouldn't be doing its thing.
That's a different thing. You can bring a tuning fork clock or a
but all those things are made out of atoms.
clock.
All those things are made out of atoms that should be stressed by the gravitational interactions they're having.
No, it is true that gravity affects the ticking of clocks also. That's general relativity, but we don't even have to be with gravity here. We can be with everything in an inertial frame where there's no space-time curvature, hence meaning no gravity. And this is still true that the something that's moving at the speed of light, its clock doesn't tick in your rest frame.
Well, it's computationally true, right? But as we've discovered, there can be many computational methods that describe the same reality. Like, I guess it's like worth pointing out that we've taken a very different approach to quantum mechanics because, you know, my background is in elastic harmonics and material science fundamentally. And so we've taken the approach of, hey, what if we can design a structure for the atom, an architecture, which is capable of all of these spooky actions? What if the atoms are actually physically connected to one another? And so these bidirectional communications can fall out as a product of that connectivity. And
you know who you want to have on your show? Absolutely, is Christoph Schiller.
Okay.
Christoph Schiller is a physicist who has worked out all the details of this connected, not just atoms, but elementary particles. He's got all the elementary particles connected. And he not only has worked out the kind of details from a sort of diagrammatic, intuitive way, he's worked out the details of reproducing the standard model from all of this.
Nice. Yeah.
In detail. Like he can reproduce all the gauge fields and all the gauge symmetries and all the elementary particles. And he's even starting to work on the fundamental constants that are sort of added into the standard model by hand, like the fine structure constant and the neutrino mixing angles and the particle masses and things like this, the things that the standard model doesn't answer. Even more fundamental things like why are there 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. He's got answers at varying levels of exactitude for all these things. And not only that, he's got like 1,000 predictions that if any, he's got 1,000 sort of tests, and if any violated, it invalidates his theory. So his book is full of one after the other of, if we find another elementary particle, my theory is invalid. If we find another elementary gauge force, my theory is invalid. If we find anything that happens that's smaller than the Planck scale, my theory is invalid. And he's got like hundreds of these sort of gates that his theory has to pass. If we find supersymmetry, his theory is invalid. You know, all these different, like rather bold claims about things that will invalidate his theory. But it does have, the reason I mentioned is because it's got everything connected in a very kind of understandable way. But I'll leave you to talk to him about it.
All right, we will follow up on that. Should we pivot to regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, if you want. I definitely want to have time to talk about the sphere motivation culture, the death cult culture.
All right, death cult or regenerative agriculture?
Well, we can kind of smoothly arc between them, I think.
All right.
I mean, lots of people, even on, quote unquote, our team, are very upset by the destructive aspects of our current food system, at least in the industrialized West, particularly in the United States and similar countries. And what is wrong with it? It relies on heavy inputs of pesticides and fossil fuels, and it relies on destructive practices that ruin the soil, which is not just the pesticides and the fossil fuels, but monocropping and plowing and extraction of the, depletion of the water tables and all this kind of stuff. We're basically mining the natural capital of our land that was built up over millennia of the giant herds of animals that built the topsoil, and we're mining that topsoil, and it's going to disappear sooner or later, and the whole system really can't go on after that, in spite of all the nonsense about vertical farms. And so we have a destructive system, polluting system, a system which is driving the farmers bankrupt and driving small farms completely out of business, a system that is producing food that is unhealthy, and malaligned incentives where we subsidize corn and soy and all this toxic stuff that people arguably shouldn't be eating, at least in most forms. Um, and and then there's all these derivative uh, ridiculousness, like trying to get rid of animals and stuff like this, which is just absolutely absurd. But that's a separate topic, except for the fact that regenerative ranching is part of regenerative agriculture. But the okay, and the food is unhealthy. I think I mentioned that, and the farm economy is unhealthy, and we have increasing polarization between urban and rural. We have dying soils, and all kinds of poisons in our food, and all the wrong food, and so that's very doomy. That's very fiery, right? That's like, oh, we're screwed. But the thing about regenerative agriculture is it offers an alternative way to look at this, and this is something that's been demonstrated. All kinds of places, poor countries, rich countries, you name it. You can bring the land back to life. You can revitalize the farm economy. You can make healthy food. You can give people meaningful work on the land. You can heal the polarization between urban and rural, because actually, like, the only place I've ever seen, except possibly for RFK's recent candidacy, the only place I've ever seen like Team Red and Team Blue kind of under the same tent, both literally and figuratively, is when you go to these regenerative agriculture lectures that are out in rural America, and you have these pioneers of regenerative agriculture like Gabe Brown and Joel Salatin and Abe Collins and Wes Jackson, Rodale. I mean, there's a whole list of, I can send you my list, but you have these people lecturing and trying to get these farmers to learn about regenerative agriculture. And what you see under these tents where they're listening to these lectures is you see like MAGA hat wearing, rural, like multi-generational farmers. And you also see urban people who've been somewhat successful, younger people who want to get away from the city and want to buy a farm and do something nice and small scale, and maybe it's organic or regenerative. Like, you get the kind of liberal urban, formerly urban people out there literally under the same tent with the rural, more Republican types, and they're in agreement on this stuff. And I don't know of any other area of activity where you find this. You might find some of it in like the traditional conservationist movement, where you have environmentalists as well as hunters and fishermen. Might be another example, but there's an overlap there as well with the regenerative ag people and
But there's a lot of influences that are pressing from the outside to prevent these sorts of changes, right? Like you said, that there's a lot of these large farms that are buying up the small farmers because the economics is squeezing them out. And all of these systems are pretty entrenched in terms of profit motives, right? So if you suddenly get people to realize that eating super processed food is bad for you, and you do it not, you do it from the perspective of convincing people from a grassroots level, you're still in conflict with these massive marketing machines of well-moneyed interests that are actively
who've captured government agencies, like the same way that arguably the pharma industry has to some extent captured the drug approval agencies, the agrochemicals and seed companies and such like this have captured the agriculture agencies. But this is, again, not as overwhelmingly horrible, I think, as people tend to believe. There's a large group of people, I know this because I've been working on some land with some friends in Northern California. There are people in the used to be called the Soil Conservation Service. It's got a new name, or the NR. There are these field agents who work for the USDA who come and help farmers with their soil.
It's the Natural Resource Conservation Service now.
Yes. And these people, a lot of them are young. They're graduates of ecology programs, and they are wise to this regenerative stuff. Now, the heads of their agencies may not be, and the people who craft and lobby and create the farm bills which tend to be influenced by the big ag companies and the big chemical companies and et cetera, big processing companies, they kind of have it in a way captured so that the crop insurance and the crop subsidies only go to you if you're growing monocrop soy or monocrop wheat or monocrop corn and you're using certain techniques. But there are, I think, a slowly advancing group of people in the agencies, at least at the federal level, that are advocating and hospitable towards some regenerative practices. So I'm hoping that will not be stifled completely. And it's going to take this kind of one small step at a time, but there's more and more farms like this. Like you probably know this, you can now order food and meat from like verified, regeneratively sourced providers. And this is becoming more popular. Like when I first started this a number of years ago, there was just a handful of these places. Now there's probably, I don't know how many, but hundreds, I would guess. That means you can get it more locally. And so I think progress is being made. I totally agree that there's moneyed interests who captured government agencies and who own a lot of land and who are kind of blocking or unaware or hostile to these other practices. And that's doubly problematic because for a lot of these farmers, they can't switch. Like they're living harvest to harvest. And if you go and switch from the way you're doing things to a new way of doing things, you're never going to have the yields initially that you had prior to switching. And so they need to be bridged for a few years while they get these new practices under their belt. And eventually, the yields still arguably are lower, but the profitability is higher because you're not spending all this money on external inputs like fertilizer and pesticide and patented seeds. And, you're growing polyculture and you maybe have animals mixed in. And you can end up being more profitable even if your bushels per acre is less. And what the farmers actually care about is profitability. They don't care about bushels per acre fundamentally. So, but it takes a while to get there. And it's complicated because it's a process of education. It's a process of someone's got to invest and take the risk and put up the money initially. And unlike the kind of monocrop industrial solution, there's no one size fits all. You can't just say, plant these seeds, put on this fertilizer, pump the water, and here's what you can get if the weather holds. With regenerative practices, they have to be tailored to the individual ecology, to the individual geology and soil biology, to the individual climate, to the individual resources that are available to the people working the land and to the market. So with all that variability, there's not just the resources available to people, but the knowledge available to people. With all that variability, there's no one solution that works. That's not going to work in like the Sahel in Africa, just like it works in Iowa, right? It's just, so there's no industrial scale, simple in the sense of low complexity solution. It's a high complexity thing that's tailored to all sorts of local circumstances.
And that strikes me as being the problem of our times, which is that people want to look around and they want to be able to have more tailored solutions, but we're pressed up against the necessities of sustaining a sufficiently large population where the productivity of bushels per acre is actually important because that's the amount that you have to grow in order to maintain a global food supply.
Well, I would argue with that. That's the amount you need to grow in order to maintain profitability with government subsidized crop insured monocrops. But it is arguable that we grow way too much corn and we grow way too much soy and we grow arguably way too much wheat, and we'd be much better off if we had less food, but it was more nutritious.
Do you think that those things get overgrown because of government subsidies directly?
Well, it's not just government subsidies. It's government subsidies for the way things are, for the status quo. And the status quo cannot be entirely laid at the feet of the government. It's the government, it's the corporations, it's the knowledge and practices in place on the farms, it's the expectations of society and the current demands of the market. And it's a coordination problem, right? Because you kind of have to move the needle in all of these different dimensions to change to something significantly new. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's been done. There's more and more places that are doing it now, and so I'm very enthusiastic about it. I'm not a farmer. I'm not a rancher. I have some property with some friends that's adjacent to farms and ranches, and we're sort of reaching out and doing some experiments on our land, because there's other things you can do to bring the land more back to life, especially in places like Northern California and Southern California, but many places in the world where it's kind of degraded land, a bit dry, it's hilly, it's not suitable for row crops. But there's things you can do, particularly to fix the hydrology. I'll send you a link on this because there's a very interesting person you might want on your show about this. But you can do these small scale interventions to fix hydrology. So what are the big problems? And this is very related to regenerative ag. And it's also related to remote sensing and the kind of work I do at Planet Labs. One of the big problems is when you have a degraded land, which arguably, if it's like hilly chaparral, like in much of California, why is it degraded? It's because for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of buffalo roamed this land, chased around by wolves and cougars and Native Americans and fires. They were always on the move, these giant herds, and they had to be on the move because they were shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of thousands of them, and they'd stomp and they'd poop and they'd pee and they'd drool and they'd eat the grass, and then it would be gone after a day, and they have to move on, and that's how the topsoil was built up. And then, when those herds were killed with the European settlers, and when we instituted all kinds of fire control and tried to keep wildfires from burning, and we put up fences and all this kind of stuff, we screwed up that system. And so then people were like, okay, I want a ranch, so I'm going to buy 100 acres, and I'm going to put 100 cows on it, and I've got 1 cow per acre. And what's that cow going to do? It's going to eat all the sweetest morsels and kind of sit around, and they're not going to be bunched together in a herd eating everything. So the grass is going to die because the grass needs to be eaten regularly to stimulate its roots, because it's a perennial. It co-evolved with these herbivore creatures. And when the herbivore creatures aren't eating it, because there's not enough of them concentrated to make a difference, it starts to die. Now, what did people think? They were ranching 100 cattle on 100 acres, and the land was starting to die. And what did the government in its infinite wisdom say? You're overgrazing. Cut down the number of animals. So they'd cut down the number of animals, and it would keep dying. And now what you're left with is like the deserts of the Southwest, like, Arizona and New Mexico and Texas, which used to be, when the conquistadors first came to this continent, the grass was higher than their horses. They couldn't even see each other when they were a distance from each other in Arizona. And now it's all just desert. And why is that? It's because those giant herds were removed. And now, with this constant drumbeat that they're overgrazing and it's making deserts, they've removed all the animals, and now it's like, I don't know if I'd call it a wasteland, because I live in the desert and it's very beautiful, but it's like, it is not lush like it used to be. And so
I wonder if that's not a collection of different forces. So I was looking it up, and it looks like bison weren't in California after about 10,000 years ago. And so the bison have been gone for a long ass time. I could be wrong about that.
I'm not sure about that.
I'm cursory search. And so
But the humans had already been here for almost 10,000 years of that, at least.
Right. But I do also think that there was a very, very different climate in California, because at some point the Central Valley had water in it. At some point the Salton Sea had water in it. And obviously we're redirecting a lot of that for agriculture and irrigation. But I'm like, it's always so hard to look into the past and to be able to tell the number of complex events that all came together to create the situation that we have. And obviously, there were more animals in the landscape, and there's no way that removing all of those animals from the landscape isn't creating terrible, terrible consequences. Because we live in Oregon.
Well, I don't, if we would have called it terrible, I'm not sure. It is creating consequences, and it may be consequences that we, in retrospect, wish hadn't been created. I mean, nature kind of somewhat takes care of itself and adapts, and it's like, the question is, will it get rid of us, right? And so,
And that's isn't that a terrible consequence if it does?
A terrible what?
Wouldn't it be a terrible consequence if it does get rid of us? Because my thought is that if there is a regenerative state in which we can load the environment and have it be still fruitful, then when we surpass that state, what we're doing is we're, in the most selfish way possible, endangering ourselves.
Okay. I want to recast that in terms of a positive vision.
All right.
I believe that we can have an ecosystem that supports way more people than we currently support, and it can support it with great diversity, and it can support it with great beauty, and it can support it with great welfare for all creatures, not just humans. But it's complicated. It's not just that you apply the same procedure to every piece of land if you're grazing it on the 80% of land that you can't, 80% of arable land that you can't farm, or if you're farming it on the 20% of arable land that you can farm. You've got to have a polycultural, diversified, regenerative approach. But I believe it can be done, and it can make for a landscape that supports nutritious food for more people, that is restorative and regenerative. And so I don't believe we have this choice between supporting the people or having beauty and biodiversity. I think we can do it both, and I think we have to try. I mean, the current situation is not sustainable. So we need to do something else, and so we should get started before it's a big crisis, and or it's a bigger crisis. And I just wanted to come back to the hydrological thing, and then I'll stop. So whatever the situation with bison in North America or California may have been, one thing that's clear is that there are 1,000 times as many beavers in California as there are now. And these beavers would dam up all the creeks. And when the creeks are dammed, the water stays on the land for much longer. The current situation, the beavers have all moved to the big rivers because they need water to live, and they need to put their burrows in places where there's a lot of water. And for various reasons, the beavers aren't on the open landscape anymore. But what they used to do when they were there is they would build their beaver dams, and the beaver dams would cause the water to pool, and then the water would pool, and it would bring, plants and animals would come because it was water was there, and the water tables would get infiltrated, and things were good. Now, for whatever reason, that situation has changed. But what you can do is make minor interventions in the hydrology, like build fake beaver dams, little tiny ones all over the place. And now the water doesn't run off. Like in Northern California, when it rains, the water just rushes through these creeks and it's gone pretty fast, And that's not what you want for healthy soil and healthy ecosystems. You want the water to hang around. You want the water to do two things when it rains. You either want it to go into the water table, or you want it to get taken up by the roots of plants and transpired, evapotranspired, which makes for cooling. It cools the local climate. It causes more rain because it's cooler, and it brings more life. But with the situation in a degraded landscape, the water runs off and erodes the soil and doesn't get into the plants and doesn't get into the water table. All this valuable fresh water just rushes into the sea, and cities do the same thing with their storm drains and stuff. And like LA could have all the water it needs if it just captured its rainwater, but it doesn't. When it rains really hard in LA, like it did, a couple of months ago, it's like all that water just rushes into the sea. It's so ridiculous. And minor and major hydrological projects can fix all this. And if you fix the hydrology, the climate will fix itself. The biodiversity will fix itself. The soil will fix itself. So that's a place where I believe we can intervene. And we can even intervene using remote sensing and AI and autonomous vehicles if we want to, that like make these dams kind of with semi-intelligent behavior. This is all a wide open field for high tech. Like we can combine high tech with tailor-made local regenerative solutions in places where labor is too expensive or to do it by hand.
Is there issues with finding profitability through that? Because I'm imagining the beaver ponds brings an increase in biodiversity and obviously has benefits in the long run across the entire landscape, but it seems hard for me to imagine money directly changing hands over the construction of the beaver pond.
Here's where we might even start to point to something which I don't like to point to.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's good, but that's like carbon credits and a more generalized system of natural capital credits. See, if people, I think carbon credits are kind of quite silly, but I think that if we had credits for natural capital, like water table and soil health, and we could use soil carbon content in there too, because I do think that soil carbon is something we want to increase. I don't really care that much if people buy their offsets for airplane flights and we call it, I just believe that like,
those should be called carbon indulgences.
Yeah, I think that's a fine way to put it. Yeah. Whereas if you're actually sequestering carbon in the soil, to me, it doesn't even matter that you've taken it out of the atmosphere. That's secondary. That's arguably not even a good idea because we're almost at the level where plants can't grow. But this is where I'm a super contrarian on
we
CO2
had a really fantastic conversation with this guy called Forrest Bishop, who wrote a series of blogs called The Pleistocene Murders. And he laid out this entire theory for how the role of humans was actually to increase the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because of plants needing it and because the size of herds that can be sustained on current carbon dioxide levels is actually far smaller than even a couple hundred years ago. I mean, it was pretty far out there, but I think that there's like a little pearl in there.
Not familiar with that. There's a number of contrarians who are advocating for that CO2 levels are in some sense quite below optimum at present. But be that as it may, I think that no one will advocate that we want. No one would advocate that we don't want more carbon in the soil. We do want more carbon in the soil. We do want more water in the soil. We do want more diversity in the soil. How we get there, again, it depends on where you are and who you are, and what you have and what you know. But it can be done, and they've got to help. And so if the question is how to pay for it, there's a number of ways to look at that. You can pay for it with I mean, look, all kinds of NGOs are paying all kinds of countries like Indonesia and Brazil to not cut down their forests. Well, maybe they could pay some to other countries to capture their water and rebuild their soil. I mean, if you're trying to not just virtue signal, but actually improve the environment, and you're a large-scale philanthropic or government organization that's sending money to places to do this, which we're checking with Planet Labs. Like, one of the things we do is check and make sure that when some place says they're not going to cut down their forest, we check with our satellites that they're actually not cutting it down. Because, of course, what they arguably like to do is get the money for not cutting it down while they're cutting it down and getting the money for cutting it down. So that's I'm not saying that everybody's doing this, but this is sort of one of the things we test for.
Have you caught people doing that?
Well, I mean, we certainly have found a lot of illegal deforestation, but as to, who's doing it and who's sanctioning it and, this sort of thing, that's a question that, again, is very detailed question on case-by-case basis.
You personally are not knocking on doors finding illegal loggers, is what you're saying?
No, but we're definitely providing data to people who provide information to, say, governments who are going to have to knock on doors if they want to keep getting their money for preserving their forests. But
I want
There,
I want to see if you can lay out this credit market a little bit better, because I've heard of carbon credit markets. I've also heard kind of criticisms of them, but I don't know enough to
sure.
be able to evaluate.
I'm not an expert in this field, but it just seems to me if we can have a carbon credit market, we should be able to have a soil carbon market. We should be able to have a soil moisture market. We should be able to have even a biodiversity markets. And what we need to do is start valuing natural capital appropriately rather than just externalizing all these costs and pretending like they're not actually costs. And once we do that, if we do it, arguably the costs of unsustainable, destructive land use will raise, and the cost of regenerative practices will be lowered. But it's going to require some kind of alteration to the incentive structures.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I wonder if you said earlier that you had this vision of a really beautiful ecosystem with even more people on the landscape. Do you have a picture of that you can describe?
Um,
I guess vision is probably the more aimed high version.
Lots of animals on land that otherwise doesn't have them right now. Some animals on cropland, because if correctly managed, they can benefit the soil and do all sorts of things. I'm not an expert on these things, but my vision is really sort of pastoral, but not necessarily in the way that people think of pastoral, which like is got no humans and a couple of cows and nothing else. My version of pastoral is more like the ancient world, but you can't do it with buffalo roaming wherever they want. Like you got to do it with electric fences and GPS collars and managed grazing. But I don't see why there aren't like thousands and thousands of ruminant animals on every hill in California. Like, what are we doing? Every molecule of carbon that they put back into the atmosphere, the grass pulls out of the atmosphere to begin with. So it's a closed cycle. This idea that we have to kill off animals in order to save the climate seems to me just patently absurd on its face. We had a lot more animals long ago, and the climate was fine.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we were talking to Michael Hudson a couple days ago, and he has this, he was an early pioneer of modern monetary theory, and he has a body of work on the nature of debt and the way that ancient civilizations that survived for a long time dealt with debt by forgiving it periodically for wage earners, not necessarily for those that are making unearned income off of land or whatever. But it struck me while we were talking to him that in order for debt to be forgiven, which seems like a plausibly good idea, you have to have a lot of other changes occur simultaneously in order to prevent the equilibrium from just setting back into exactly the place where it was before. And so you have this coordination systems problem where in order to achieve the goal that you want, which is more animals on the landscape, it has to be this concerted push from all places in multiple different directions. And I think that this is maybe why siloing is so dangerous, right? Because you have one group of people that are working on ruminants, somebody else who's working on beavers, somebody else who's working on regenerative agriculture, and all of those people should ideally be coming together and coordinating in order to transform entire regions. And I think that's still not happening yet because these efforts are still kind of in their early days.
Yeah, I would agree. As far as the economics goes, that's really outside of my wheelhouse. I don't understand enough about it to comment intelligently, except to say that it seems to me it's likely that we want to avoid the further concentration of land holdings in the form of giant companies, be they Chinese or American, and particularly not in the hands of anti-animal activists. But that's just my personal opinion. I, I I think that people are waking up to this partially because of the internet and partially, just more information is getting around, and so the siloing is perhaps a little less of a problem, like the USDA people who came out and helped us on this land that I was referring to, like they've been to college, they've studied all these things, they've studied hydrology and soil science and ecology and agriculture. I mean, they're just they're into all of it, geology, all of it. Like, everybody's getting smarter, pretty much. So that's a great thing. Yeah, I guess the last thing I'm going to say is, for me, it's exciting because this is one place where my remote sensing day job overlaps my passion. I mean, there are other places where my passion is also overlapping in math and applied physics, but I'm really excited that satellite imaging, along with a host of other technologies, can really move the needle on this regenerative practices, because you look, we have all this stuff we didn't have before. We've got satellite imaging, we've got drones, we've got AI, we've got cheap sensors of various sorts that we can put on the ground. We've got all sorts of things which haven't even been invented, but could be, we've got these GPS collars on animals, which eliminate the need, if you want to eliminate it, for having a bunch of shepherds. There's a lot of things that this is this sort of positive vision. We can combine the best of ancient wisdom and practices with modern technology. It's not an either or situation. There's a hybrid that can be made that combines the best of both worlds. And, that to me is where it's at.
Do you think the beautiful vision of what could be possible is potentially an equivalently strong motivator to the fear of what would happen if we don't do those sorts of things?
Yes and no. I don't think fear is really much of a motivator. And what I mean by that is, what fear motivates most people to do is just stay home and,
safety.
Not think about it, or safety. And also they don't want to think about it. It's like, if the message is one of doom and gloom and fear, to a large extent, people will just say, well, I can't do anything about it. And either I'm going to be depressed or I'm going to just ignore the problem and try not to be depressed. So I don't think fear is a great motivator to move people in the right direction. It's not it's not a zero, but people have to actually have their eyes on a goal in order to move in the direction of the goal. If you just are trying to get away from something that you're afraid of, you're much more likely to just run in the wrong direction.
Or just start drinking.
Yeah, but that's sort of it. I also mean is that, like, if you just think of a situation where, let's say a sort of prototypical ancient, situation where, like, there's a dangerous predator and you see it now, and it sees you. Now, what are you going to do? Are you just going to run away from it with no thought about where you're actually going? No. If you do that, you'll probably run off a cliff or into a cactus, or you'll end up in a terrible situation, because you're not actually focusing on a desired goal. You're just focusing on avoiding an undesirable goal. And then in high dimensional systems, like all these complicated solutions we're trying to develop for complicated problems with all sorts of variables, there's an infinite number of directions that move you away from what you're afraid of. It's not clear that any of the directions you choose are going to move you closer to where you want to go. If what I want to do is go north, and the thing is right about to get me, I might decide to go east or south, and I'm still increasing the distance to the undesired state, but I'm still increasing the distance to the undesired state, but I'm also increasing the distance to the desired state if I go off in the wrong direction. So you've got to know where you want to go in the right direction, even if you're afraid of something and trying to get away from it. You can't get towards where you want to go by just moving away from what you don't want to be near. That's my point. And I think that's a mathematical truth.
It seems like it's like a special type of personality. I wonder if it's involved with the contrarian personality type too, that is willing to hear a problem and solution, which are usually given at the same time, and then to step back and reorient towards the solution set, and imagine a landscape of possibilities, and then move towards the one that you find to be whatever most salient, most empowering, whatever your value is.
It's harder to do it's harder to move towards the solution than it is to move away from the problem. Away from the problem, there's a million ways you can go, and you'll be seemingly getting away from that problem. Now you're probably going towards a bunch of other problems that you neglected to notice. But like you run away from the tiger and you run off the edge of a cliff. This is what happens if you don't pay attention to where you're headed, and only worried about what you're heading away from. But the other thing is that it requires work. Like in order to get somewhere that you want to go, you actually have to visualize and see where you want to go. You have to figure out how to get there. You have to, engineer systems and procedures and methods that are likely to achieve this. You have to discipline in a disciplined way, put them into practice. This is much harder than just being afraid and, seeking refuge.
It takes a little bit of time too, right? Which is really interesting. So you hear this about people who have been in military conflicts too, right? Where as soon as like the bullets start flying, like your instinct is just to duck and run or whatever, or hide or freeze. But the military trains people against this, right? Because the first thing you have to do is orient yourself towards the problem. Like you need to be able to not move immediately, but actually take an inventory of the situation, which is counterintuitive because you really just want every fiber of your being wants to just get out of there. But if you actually want to survive or you want to thrive in that situation, the first thing you have to do is actually slow everything down and take inventory, look and see what the options are, and then move towards the best solution. But it's very difficult.
I believe Douglas Adams may have said it best, right? Don't panic.
Yeah. I mean, did you see this work out for you when you were having your health problems and statins were put on the table in front of you? Where you basically had this thing that was a consequence looming over you, and instead of just doing the most obvious solution, which is to take the statins, you had to step back and organize your thoughts and figure out what you were going to aim for?
To be honest, in that particular case, I'd already, discovered some of the anti-statin literature just because I was listening to the low carb people, and there's a heavy overlap there. And by the way, I was listening extensively way before COVID to Asim Malhotra, who's one of the great anti-statin cardiologist crusaders. So this is another thing that happened that has to do with COVID and contrarianism and all this stuff. I'd been listening to all these contrarian voices on health who it seemed to me had much more solid data backing up their positions. Asim Malhotra, Robert Lufkin, Ivor Cummins, even Peter Attia to some extent, although he's pro-statin. Like the list goes on. I'm sure you know many of these people in the low carb community and the intermittent fasting community and the take control of your own health community, and even Stephen Gundry to some extent, although he's a little bit too anti-meat for me, but he's open. But I was listening to all these people before COVID, and then COVID comes along, and they all wind up in the contrarian camp. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Like, how can it be that the people, doctors and stuff that I was listening to long before COVID, pretty much almost all of them, rather than the 80-20 ratio I was talking about before, they were like 20-80. Like they were all contrarians about COVID. And I was like, okay, that's interesting to me because I kind of trust these people already. And I don't trust these other people already based on health, nutrition, and agriculture. And then sure enough, they end up kind of with similar probabilities and conclusions that I have. So I forgot what the initial question was about statins. So I wasn't really afraid. Like I was upset that I had these bad test results, but if that's a whole rabbit hole, like is LDL really harmful and the statins really help even if they do lower LDL, and what's the right thing to do if statins aren't the right thing to do, and how does that affect the individual? But I was obviously super into learning and doing my own research. Was that comedian? Did you see that thing that went around virally a couple of weeks ago where this great comedian, he was up there and he was saying something like, they told us to not do our own research. He said, you know, not that long ago, doing your own research was called reading. So anyway, that was pretty funny. I love to read, so I was reading all kinds of stuff. And
I mean, it seems like there's a layer to this, though. Like all those people had already set themselves slightly orthogonal to the standard hospital administration in the first place. Because, like, I don't know, I have like someone in my family who's squarely in the medical profession, and we'd been talking about all of these controversial topics surrounding COVID and statins actually too. And I sent him that Malhotra conversation. He was like, "Oh yeah, like, well, I'll check it out and we'll have a conversation." I just never heard from him ever again. It was just like, I think it's just too much in the face of everything that they're professionally obligated to be doing inside of that context. It
is a very rare person who can, it's easy enough for me. I'm not a cardiologist. I haven't been treating patients with all these standard of care kinds of things. It's easy for me as an outsider to say, I don't believe in it and I don't want to do it and you shouldn't do it either. It's another thing for a cardiologist who's made his career or her career doing it to say I was wrong. That is so difficult on a number of levels.
Well, there's monetary consequences, because if it turns out that the entire profession has been incorrectly advising people to do something and this has led to worse outcomes, that's a class action lawsuit waiting to happen. And you can't actually, there's just so many situations where it's like this, where there's a problem. And if everybody was able to say, hey, we're just going to have an opinion jubilee, and we can just change our minds and we can walk out the other side and just
good idea. An opinion jubilee. I love that. I love that tag. I'm going to remember that phrase. That's great. That's like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where you admit that you were wrong and we agree to not prosecute you.
But an opinion jubilee sounds a lot more fun than a Trust and Reconciliation Commission meeting. And so
fair enough.
I don't know. I think that there's so many things in the world to be suspicious of, and it's really straightforward on the individual level. Like you're saying, you can have conversations with your friends. You can test it out on yourself. Like I cut carbs recently and it feels better. Like it's easier to run. It's easier to exercise.
For most Americans, it's the right thing to do. I mean, there's no one size fits all solution, but if I was going to make one recommendation to almost every American, it would be to cut out carbs. They're unessential. They're basically poison for most people, and almost everyone eats far too many of them. Anyway, I want to say one other thing about this opinion jubilee. So I spent 32 years at NASA, and what NASA does when they have a mission failure, I've posted about this, although I don't think I wrote it on Substack. I'm not sure. When NASA has a mission failure, they've had many. Apollo 1 fire, Apollo 13, the Challenger explosion, the Columbia reentry failure, which killed all those astronauts, as well as lots of unmanned, uncrewed missions that have had partial or total mission failure. The Hubble Space Telescope went up and it was out of focus. And the Galileo probe, was it Galileo? One of the probes to Jupiter failed to deploy its antenna and it was crippled. There's all kinds of mission failures that happen at NASA. Fortunately, not all that often, but they happen. When they happen, here's what NASA does. They stand up a committee. It's usually called a anomaly investigation board or a failure investigation commission. And they populate this committee with outsiders who are nevertheless experts or near experts in the field with good credentials, but they're not involved. They were not involved with the program at all. They make a committee of these people. They give them access to all data and all personnel who worked on the program. And the personnel are instructed to answer all questions truthfully and to provide all data. And they go and they look and they try to figure out what caused the failure. And they pretty much always figure it out. And then they write up what happened, their findings, including dissenting opinions, which Richard Feynman wrote a very famous one for the Challenger accident. They write up their report of what went wrong, and they write up the lessons learned about why it went wrong, and they write up their recommendations to prevent it from ever happening again. Now, these things usually are, as I said, they usually figure it out, and these things usually really help. Like the mistakes don't happen again on another project, at least not for 10 years or so, at which point sometimes these things are forgotten and arguably similar mistakes are made. But they do make a big difference, and they help ensure the collective memory and the institutional culture, and prevent repeats of the same mistakes, at least to some extent. And so I had always thought, even early on in COVID, as soon as it became apparent that a lot of stuff was arguably horribly misguided, I thought this is what we need for COVID. We need to stand up a committee, or maybe several committees, like one on masks and one on vaccines and one on lockdowns and one on school closures and one on this, that, and the other thing. We need to stand up one of these committees, and we need to like populate it with people who don't have a vested interest, and give them access to all the information, and have them like do the best possible job at figuring out what went wrong, not to blame people, but just to prevent it from happening again. And I thought this was going to happen. I thought, surely, like, this is what we should do. This is what NASA does. NASA's a government agency. Agencies can do this, but they don't have this culture, unfortunately, most of them. And I think the military might have this culture to some extent. I'm not that familiar with it, but arguably not, because they keep getting involved in these forever wars and making similar mistakes. But I would imagine at some level they have it. But be that as it may,
that seems more like misaligned incentives to me.
Fair enough, but we didn't do it with COVID, and now I'm kind of thinking we can't. And the reason I'm thinking we can't is not just because of burnout, because not everyone's burned out, but or not that there's people who couldn't do it. It's almost like there's no one left who's not polarized on it. Like, who are you going to find on this committee who truly has an open mind, who hasn't already made up their mind? I don't know that you could. And so that worries me, because as you were saying earlier, Shallow, about like, why aren't we, you mentioned this earlier, like, why aren't we just looking into what happened and correcting ourselves and preventing it from happening again? Yes, there's misaligned incentives and vested interests and people who want to get away with murder or whatever, you put quotes around it or don't. There's like hardly anyone left who isn't already polarized in one direction or another. And so there's a lot of things preventing it from happening. I think the closest thing I've seen to it is RFK's book, is A Letter to Liberals, which is a free ebook. And it is the most exhaustive examination of what happened during COVID. It's not very long. I think it's like a little over 100 pages, but it's, it's reads kind of like the sort of report I would have expected out of one of these committees. But it's, it's just one guy, and he's a polarizing figure. And so that's not the optimum solution. But
he's also a censored figure too, right? He's like, he had a best-selling book that didn't show up on any of the bestseller lists and so on.
And this is another one, and I don't know if you can call a free book a bestseller since he's not selling it. So,
I know. I was thinking he wrote one about Fauci, and it sold like crazy, and it didn't show up. It wasn't in the New York Times. It wasn't in the Wall Street Journal. It wasn't on any of the lists.
This one is a different book. It's more recent. It's much shorter, and it's not about Fauci. It's just about. It's kind of like Berenson's published a couple of books a few years ago. One on masks, one on lockdowns, one on fatality rates, but. There's been a few efforts at this, but there've been single people, they're polarizing people, they're censored people, they're polarized people, like what their opinion is before you open the book, if you know anything about them. So, it's a small step in the right direction of trying to do an exhaustive analysis, but it would be more powerful if it was a team and it was somehow selected by people whose opinions weren't already decided. I just don't know if those people exist at this point. But I wish.
It seems to me like the problem, the polarization, if you think of what are the two phases of this polarity, it's there were problems or there weren't problems. And that's a very difficult place to start solving a problem, because if you want to solve a problem, you generally have to agree that there is a problem in the first place. But if the debate is whether there's a problem or not, I don't see how anything can move forward.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult one, but
And I think that you said something interesting earlier where you were like, okay, so if this happens again, people will have a really different mindset in terms of risk assessment, because the virus that this would unfold for would have to be far more dangerous and far more visible for people to get to the same level of reaction. And I agree with that. But I wonder if that awareness is transferable, because there's the possibility of climate lockdowns. There's the possibility of, shutting off the power grid in order to prepare for a Carrington event. And I wonder if by tuning the color of the problem, if it is able to get under people's radars again, because it's presented from a different vantage point.
Well, they don't have to shut down the power grid to prepare for a Carrington event. That doesn't add up. Like
we had a lady from NASA talking about the fact that was a possibility.
She was like planned.
She was actually the director. I was Nikki Fox. She was the director of the Stellar Research Program.
No, I think it was Madhulika.
Was it Madhulika?
I think so.
But
she's also a director in heliophysics.
Well, okay. I could see that if you knew a Carrington event was unfolding, you'd want to temporarily shut some things down, perhaps. That might be better than having catastrophic long-term failures is having a short-term failure. But I mean, all they need to do is put those capacitors in the right places, and then the Carrington event should be manageable. The climate thing is another thing. Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think another virus scare is going to do the job. They are gearing up to do the job with climate now, and that's a whole other topic for another discussion. But that's not transferable. But another respiratory virus is transferable. Like, people are going to be like, give me a break. I know I'm going to get it. I know my mask isn't going to help me. I know your vaccines are dubious. And where'd this thing come from?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to ask all those questions right away. All sorts of people, not everybody, but half the people. And so I think that it is transferable to another virus, and it's not transferable to other things. And
maybe that's how it has to go. That's how it has to go. Maybe something really bad sometimes has to happen in order for the right thing to come out on the other side. It's like the yin and the yang of the situation.
Well, at least one can say that a Carrington event, pretty unlikely to have come from a lab.
That's true.
You would know better than us at NASA.
So what's next for you? I mean, you're working on all these different projects. You have so many interests. Is there an overarching project that you really want to achieve in the next few years that you're putting a lot of effort into?
I have two. One that I can talk about, and one that I'm not quite ready to talk about, and you'll have to invite me back to talk about once it's actually got a little more traction than it currently does. The one that I'm excited about right now is, as I might have mentioned a little bit early on, I've really gotten back into AI and machine learning and machine vision because of all this data that our satellites bring down, and the fact that nobody can really look at all this data, but they somehow want to analyze it. And so I'm working on some projects in that area right now, and I'm very excited about it. I'm learning a lot. I'm working with really great people, and I'm impressed by our progress, although it's baby steps at this time. So that will keep me occupied for a while, but hopefully not too long, because our progress is fast enough. Then it'll be ready for to be deployed, hopefully in the not too distant future.
What's the role of AI in that project? Is it an assistant to your search, or is it coming up with new problems that you didn't know existed before?
No, it's not really AI. It's what I like to call IA, intelligence amplification. It's
I like that.
Humans and AI systems working together to answer questions about remote sensing data. So in some sense, the simplest version is searching large databases of imagery to find certain things that humans are looking for, or make predictions or notice certain changes, all those things. Yeah, and AI is just part of it. It's a human in the loop kind of thing. Like a lot of these big new AI systems they have human training on top of the AI. In the case of many of these systems, the training is to censor the AI from offending people. And in our case, since you can't really offend people with remote sensed images of the Earth, it's pretty hard. It's going to be to actually answer questions.
Can you give us an example of a question, like a example question?
How many swimming pools were built in this county last year, and are they on our tax records?
Why would you want to know that?
I don't know that I'd want to know that, but somebody might want to know that. How many acres of forest were planted versus cut down in this area over the last year, and where did it happen?
Do you find that you guys ever get answers that are in conflict with what is being presented? Because I can imagine that being a place where you can really quickly start to offend people. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so like you wrote on the blog.
We have our imagery has offended people. Okay, I don't exactly know the complete details of this, but we found India claimed this and Pakistan claimed that in the contested region, and we went and looked, and we were like, well, here's what's actually happening on the ground. So one side or the other or both were not happy with that, right? But this is a classic problem for remote sensing with satellites. A lot of people don't want to. They want to control the narrative about what's happening on the ground, and to some extent, satellites. Our company would like to be the source of truth for this stuff. Now, that is a big statement, and it carries with it a lot of difficulties, both technological and political. But nonetheless, it is in theory possible that one could be sort of a trusted global source of truth about what's going on, certain aspects of what's going on the ground at present and in the past. One interesting thing about our company is we image all the land area of the Earth every day, including coastal regions and territorial waters. And so you can go back in time and find out what was happening before, even if you didn't think to. Most satellites, you have to tell them where to look. Ours are looking everywhere every day because we have enough of them to do this. And they don't look at high resolution, like they can't see people and stuff like this, but they can see other things. And so yeah, it offends. Sometimes people are upset, and they might even cancel their contracts with us because they're so upset about what we published, or what we allowed to be published, or what we provided to the New York Times or whoever it might be, right? But this is just, you can't please everybody, right? And if we start allowing, it's different than social media in the sense that arguably a country can control what information goes to their people. Like, you might argue whether that's good or bad, but some countries institute censorship much more than other countries, and they will come after companies for, quote, violating the law if they distribute certain information in their country. But satellite imaging is a special case. Like, you can't go fly planes over an arbitrary country and take pictures. You're not allowed to. It's their airspace. But there's no such thing as airspace in Earth orbit. Satellites can take picture of anywhere. There's no way to stop them. I mean, unless you make an agreement with the host country. If you make an agreement, then like, we could agree. It's complicated, but in general, satellite imagery is kind of it is available to any nation or any nation's operations, companies, and stuff like that to take the imagery. Now, who gets to see it and when? The governments have some say in that, but the Indian government or the Pakistani government does not get to tell the U.S. government, you can't look at Pakistan from a satellite. Like, we can look anywhere, and anyone can look anywhere. The Chinese can look at us, the Russians can look at us, we can look at them. Like, that's kind of a settled matter. And technologically, it's got to be that way because the satellites are in their orbits, and they can't really.
Yeah.
So why are they sending these little balloons over if they can just look at us from a satellite? It's probably a dumb question.
Oh, because the balloons can get a lot closer.
Okay.
Balloons were hard to detect. Like, we know where everybody's satellites are pretty much. Balloons, since our radars were set to ignore slow-moving objects. That's how come the balloon slipped through. Now they've presumably tuned up those filters so that slow-moving objects are now of interest. And the balloons can get closer, and the balloons can carry, because they can get closer, they can do like radio snooping and things like this, which is, it's not impossible to do from satellites, but it's much more expensive because you need gigantic antennas to have high gain in space. And, maybe it was just a soft power play, like some, like, Are
there places in the United States that you're not allowed to image, that the government kind of knocks on your door and is like, you can't look there, beyond the expected ones of Air Force bases and stuff like that?
I'm going to answer that question with what I know, which is this. Because we are primarily a U.S. company, although we are also a multinational company, but because we are essentially a U.S. company as far as the regulatory regimes are concerned, we have to get permission from the U.S. government, from a whole bunch of different agencies, to be able to launch satellites and operate them for imaging and to send the data down to Earth. We have to get like NASA licenses to launch and have them in orbit. We have to get FAA licenses to launch. We have to get FCC licenses to have them to communicate up and down, because the radio spectrum allocation issues, it's a big contentious matter in orbit. And we have to get NOAA license, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for whatever reason, to image the Earth. And between all those agencies, the government in general reserves the right to execute what is called shutter control over our satellites, meaning they can tell us to not image certain places at certain times. And it's not just the US. Because we're a US company, they can say, no imaging of this place for the next month, or whatever they want to say. Now, they technically have the right to exert this shutter control at any time for any reason. They don't have to tell us the reason. In practice, they've never exerted it. They've never told us to not image anywhere, anything. So we do image all those Air Force bases and all the Area 51, you name it, right? And they haven't told us not to.
Fascinating.
And arguably our satellites are not high enough resolution to for them to worry about this. And also, they know darn well our adversaries are imaging all these places. So, why would they want to blind themselves?
Fascinating. All right. Well, that's a lot to think about. And it's clear that there's a lot left to discuss. So hopefully we get the chance to talk again in the future and hear about the next things that come out of your brain.
All right. Well, I loved it, and I really appreciate you. And it's been a delightful conversation. And until we meet again.
Thank you so much, Creon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming by. Really appreciate your work.